Hello there, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. It's Comrade Dankey coming at you today with a video all about questions that libertarian Ancaps have for communists. So let's get right into it. I'll try my best to answer these questions. I'm not a lore master, I'm not a theory master. It's not like I'm Karl Marx himself, so I probably don't have the perfect answers for all of these questions, but nevertheless, I am a humble communist and I will try my best to answer them. Cool intro, dude.
What's it gonna take for you people to realize that you can't multiply wealth by dividing it?
Alright, so the creepy skeleton man says, what's it gonna take for you to realize you can't multiply wealth by dividing it? Well, let's talk about what wealth means. Well, in a Marxist term, wealth is simply how easy it is to satisfy human needs. How easy it is to satisfy food, hunger, water, shelter. Why did I say food and hunger as two separate things? Food, water, shelter, healthcare. These things, your ability, your access to them, and your ability to have those things reflects on your wealth. So in capitalism, you have a system in which certain necessities like food and healthcare are blocked by private enterprise. They charge you money for it. So wealth is already artificially divided by the market, because at current rates of production, you could easily produce enough goods for everybody's necessities to be satisfied. But because we live in a capitalist system, because they have to make a profit, we live in a society of haves and have-nots, which is unnecessary and cruel. That's why communists like me want to change that.
What's it gonna take for you people to realize that you can't multiply wealth by dividing it?
What?
So to answer your question, scary hoodie demon man, the wealth is already divided under the capitalist system.
Say you get your commie paradise. Then, me, Mr. Dapperton, that guy T, Big Dicko, and Hoodie Demon start doing our own thing. We're minting money out of gold and trading it and hiring people voluntarily and paying them a wage they agree to without giving them ownership in the company, and are basically just over here doing our capitalist thing. What should happen to us? If your answer is that we should be left alone since we're not harming anyone else, you're actually an anarcho-capitalist. So if you're an ANCOM, you're...
Okay, so if you think that capitalists should be left alone because they aren't doing harm to anyone else, that's revisionist bullshit. Capitalism is inherently oppressive to the working class, and the communist movement is an internationalist struggle against the global bourgeoisie. So, by ignoring a certain swath of capitalists and saying, oh, they can keep their private enterprise, they can keep their private business, that's not becoming of a communist movement. However, I will admit, historically, the paradigm hasn't been, ooh, are capitalists allowed to exist? It's actually been, are communists allowed to exist? Every single time there has been a socialist movement or a communist movement arises, they have to deal with reactionary and imperialist forces. So capitalists aren't the victims here. Besides that, most communists actually want global overthrow of capital. But historically, communist movements have been willing to be diplomatic and peaceful to capitalist countries to ensure their own survival. So you want to talk about if capitalism can exist alongside socialist countries? It can. The burden is not necessarily on the socialist countries for peace. The burden is on the capitalist countries, and whether or not they will do imperialism or they will respect the people of these socialist countries and their right to self-determination.
Your answer must be something other than that. But if it is, then how is your system not a state that will impose its way of doing things on the people who don't agree with that?
That's the kind of system that communists propose. A dictatorship of the proletariat that imposes its will on the capitalist bourgeois class. I mean, I don't know what communist you've been talking to, my friend, but most communists want a dictatorship of the proletariat. That means using state power to implement socialism.
You claim that there's a distinction between personal and communal property, since there is no universally agreed upon definition of what personal property is, even among your fellow comrades. Who decides what is and isn't personal or communal property? And since an arbiter would be required, will you concede that your ideas would require a totalitarian state, or are you just going to claim that I'm straw-manning you?
Alright, so esoteric entity essentially is asking the question, what's the difference between personal property and collective property? Now, let's just use the example. Do multiple people use the item in question? For example, if you have a plow and you work on a collective farm, obviously that plow isn't going to be useful to just you. It's going to be useful to everybody who works on that farm alongside you. So would it make sense for a single person to own the only plow there? Of course not. So that plow is going to be communal property. But if you have a bed and your neighbor has a bed and their kids have beds, well then what reason is there to turn your bed, your personal sleeping bed, into communal property? It doesn't make any sense. So it's essentially a utilitarian question. What is to be considered communal? What is to be considered personal? Well, it's whatever items can be used simply by a single individual versus items that require collective use. It's the same difference we put between a person who owns a car that travels down a road and then the road itself. The road is communal property in that it belongs to and is used by everybody. The car just belongs to you. It's consumed and used by you. So I mean, it's a simple enough question, but there's also, a difference between private and personal property. Namely, private property is the means of production. If a person wants to abolish private property, when communists say we want to abolish private property, we're not saying we're going to take a person's house away from them. We're not going to take your Game Boy away from you. We're not going to take away all your video games and your food and everything that you personally own. We're going to take it away. No, socialists are only interested in claiming the means of production and redistributing that to the people. So it's kind of strange that they ask what's the difference between personal property and collective property. I mean, you can consider that difference to be the means of production itself. The plow, in the example I used earlier, was a means of production, a means of producing crops. So, that kind of thing needs to belong to the collective. Whereas personal items and effects and goods, things like that, they can belong to you. You can give them to your grandma if you want.
A totalitarian state, or are you just going to claim that I'm straw-manning you?
We can look back through history and see that the integration of capitalism into countries without a free market has worked. This being the case, I'm sure you have all been asked this before, but can you prove that communism isn't just an impossible utopia?
Alright, so finally I get a good question from Lady Machiavelli. Is communism possible? It's not just a utopia. Well, I would say yes, absolutely. It is possible. You can look at the achievements of proletarian governments in countries around the world, achievements in collectivization, achievements in literacy rates, achievements in women's liberation, the liberation of minorities, the advancement of human rights, the advancement of science. I mean, there are plenty of things accomplished by communist regimes. There are plenty of outstanding achievements. You can look at Cuba. Compare Cuba during Batista. During the time of Batista, you had a country which was essentially ruled by the mob, by the Italian mafia. And you had prostitution, you had drug problems. It was bad, folks. Cuba under Batista was bad. And then after the revolution, the communists came in and they built hospitals and they built schools and they built roads. And the literacy rate in Cuba is through the roof. You want to look at Cuba's record in terms of wildlife sustainability. They're the only country in the world that meets the World Wildlife Foundation standards for sustainability. So if you want to talk about the achievements under communism, you can talk about many different kinds of achievements. The cultural achievements, the human rights achievements, the scientific achievements. You can talk about the achievements in terms of advancing women's rights specifically. I mean, there are just so many different accomplishments that are the direct result of these socialist governments. But, you know, something tells me that these all sort of ring hollow in the ears of a libertarian. They don't really care about hearing about any of the accomplishments of these governments. So let's keep listening.
Can you prove that communism isn't just an impossible utopia?
Why do you think that equality is synonymous with freedom? Do you understand the difference?
Okay, so
Why do you think
this guy listened to reason. He wants to know if we understand the difference between equality and freedom. And let's do a little thought experiment here. What do libertarians, what do anarcho-capitalists mean when they say freedom? The freedom to have your own private property? The freedom to participate in the exploitation of another person's labor? I mean, there are fundamental freedoms that are denied by the capitalist system. And there are fundamental oppressive natures of the capitalist system. And so when he asked if do we understand the difference between equality and freedom? Of course, I understand there is a difference between equality and freedom, but this person's definition of freedom simply means the freedom for private individuals to oppress the working class. And if that's their idea of what constitutes freedom, well then I'm not really interested in what this libertarian's conception of freedom really is. I have a feeling that this person's idea of what constitutes a free, liberated society and my idea of what constitutes a free, liberated society are entirely different. My idea of a free society is one free from the oppressive nature of capitalism, and his is literally the exact opposite of that. A society where capitalism is the society. It reigns supreme.
think that equality is synonymous with freedom? Do you understand the difference? The actual working definition of capitalism
is a system of exchange between multiple private parties that occurs voluntarily without force or coercion. The notion that capitalism is anything different is likely a straw man created by collectivists to misrepresent capitalism so as to make it easier for them to represent their own arguments.
Whenever you are confronted with this definition, you immediately say, oh no, it's about exploitation and monetary hierarchy because Das Kapital says so. Do you not realize that is just as absurd as saying God is real because the Bible tells me so?
Okay, so Hoodie Demon asked a very strange question. They accuse us of strawmanning capitalism because in Das Kapital, Marx is trying to describe capitalism in terms of the labor theory of value. Capitalism being an economic system, a cycle, if you will, of investment, wage labor, and subsequent profit from that wage labor. And, I can go back and watch my video I did about a week ago talking about what is capitalism, because it describes it very, very simply in terms that I think Hoodie Demon would even be able to understand. But he defines capitalism as a system of voluntary, uncoerced exchange between private parties. That is not how capitalism works in practice. You call it voluntary exchange, but what happens in the case of imperialism? When a country declares war against another country with the intentions of opening up that country's markets to monopoly capitalism. That's essentially what happens. So, you want to talk about uncoerced exchange between private parties. What happens when one party says, no, you are going to do business with me on my terms, and if you don't, well, I'm going to kill you. So, and then also, you want to talk about capitalism being voluntary. What's voluntary about, okay, let's say that you are impoverished. You're starving. You are forced to sell your labor to a capitalist in order to make the money you need to buy food, to pay your rent, to pay your health care bills, and to survive. All right? Surviving in a capitalist system is not a voluntary thing. You have to do it. You have to sell your labor on the market to a capitalist in order to survive. There's nothing voluntary about that. It's forced on you unless you want to starve and die on the street like a dog. So, yeah, capitalism is free in that if you were on the Titanic, you had the freedom to take a lifeboat or not. And if you chose to stay behind, well, you were obviously going to die. So if you wanted to live, you had to take the lifeboat. Capitalism is that lifeboat, ladies and gentlemen. And if you want to survive, you're going to have to bow and scrape and suck your boss's dick for scrap, basically, just so you can sustain yourself.
Realize that is just as absurd as saying God is real because the Bible tells me so.
Alright, so that was also sort of a ridiculous statement. Using Das Kapital to talk about capitalism is not just as absurd as using the Bible to try to prove the existence of God, because Das Kapital was written by Marx, a scientist, an economist, somebody who had models, somebody who had theories, somebody who based what they were writing off of evidence and observation. You can't say that for the Bible, folks. So, to even equate that, using Das Kapital to talk about capitalism, to using the Bible to prove the existence of God, saying that that's an absurd but equally valid comparison, it's doesn't make any sense, my friend.
Realize that is just as absurd as saying God is real because the Bible tells me so.
Doesn't make any sense.
Capitalism means the private ownership of capital, which means an economy comprised completely of voluntary transactions. If you're against that, then you must want to initiate force on some people somewhere who aren't harming anyone else, or comprise any form of threat, or otherwise impose costs onto third parties.
Alright, so we're trying to enforce violence on people who aren't harming anyone else. Already this person doesn't understand capitalism is fundamentally exploitative. I won't repeat myself here, but it's not a voluntary system like I just said, and it's certainly not harmless. People are being harmed by the capitalist system. People's labor is being exploited by the capitalist system. It's not like this amoral, harmless, completely benign system of economics that has no bad implications whatsoever.
So tell us, which of these people do you want to use force against, and why?
Alright, so who do communists want to use force against? Communists want to use force, political violence, against the bourgeois class and those who seek to uphold those who seek to uphold the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, those who seek to enforce and reinforce the capitalist system, the police, the media. All of these people are the enemies of the working class, because all of these different groups have been completely bought and are owned and operated and controlled by the working class. Anytime you see a workers' movement or a people's movement rise up, who's there to slam the baton in their face? The cops. Who's there to lock them in prison and intimidate them? The cops. Who's there to vilify them on TV and in the newspapers? The media. And it just turns out that the cops and the media both are owned and controlled by the capitalists. So you want to talk about who do we use force against? We use force against any who impede the revolution. That's who we use force against.
Tell us, which of these people do you want to use force against and why?
How can private ownership be theft if you don't believe in property rights? You sort of need to believe in private ownership in order to conclude that taking something from somebody else would be considered theft.
Alright, so this guy is asking, how do you think ownership is theft if you have no concept of property rights? I don't know if this individual understands that in communism and in socialism, we talk about there's a difference between personal property and private property. Sort of like how I answered in the second or third question. A person's personal property is like their Game Boy, their house, their car, their clothes, stuff that they personally use every single day. A private property is like a factory. It's like a business place. It's a plot of land. It's a plow. It's tools and machinery. It's the means of production. So when a communist movement talks about taking private property away from the capitalist, they're not talking about taking the capitalist house. They're not talking about taking their car or all of their Pokemon cards or their Game Boy or anything like that. They're talking about taking the capitalist's factory. They're talking about taking their tools, their machines, the means of production. The way that capitalists produce their profit, they're talking about taking that, my friend. They're not saying you have to give up all your Game Boy games to the collective and all of your Pokemon cards will go into the collective now. That's not what it is.
To conclude that taking something from somebody else would be considered theft.
Following my first question, I wouldn't be surprised if you answered my question with just a description of communism. How can you guarantee that society will do as you wish to accomplish a communist society without the use of force?
Okay, so that's actually a good question. How do you accomplish communism without the use of force? And here's the answer to that. You can't. You need a dictatorship of the proletariat. You need state power. You need a state-run proletarian government. And so, yeah, you have to use force to seize the private property from the capitalist. Because think about it like this. If you were a capitalist and you owned a factory and all of a sudden your workers were demanding that you relinquish that factory to them, you wouldn't just give it away. You would hire a private military force to try to kill the workers. You would hire strike breakers. You would do whatever you had to do in order to ensure that your private property didn't become the collective property. So, yeah, force is absolutely necessary. The capitalists aren't going to say, oh, okay, just take my means of production then. I guess it's time for socialism. That's not going to happen, and anything to suggest otherwise is utopian bullshit.
Point, how can you guarantee that your society won't turn into a dystopia?
Okay, So, this is a question: does political violence always lead to a dystopia? And with this, I have to cite the American Civil War. Now, we freed the slaves through use of political force, through use of violence. Now, are you saying that the post-slavery United States is a dystopia? Is more of a dystopia than the antebellum plantation days? I don't think so. So, the use of force, if it is for the purpose of liberating the working class, it's for the greater good. So, of course, it won't lead to a dystopia. Not directly. It might indirectly, but that would be if other circumstances and other factors came into play. The use of force in and of itself does not lead to a dystopia.
How can you guarantee that your society won't turn into a dystopia?
Why do you feel that it is okay to take my money and give it to someone else? I earned it, so what gives you a right to it?
Okay, so this is another good question, because this is a common misconception people have. Once again, communists don't want to take your personal property. They don't want to take your money. They don't want to take your Game Boy games. They don't want to take, all of your gold coins and all of your tendies. They are only interested in seizing the means of production. So unless you keep your money in the form of factories, you don't really have anything to worry about, buckaroony. Money does not equal capital. Capital is money, but it's money that is invested. It's money that is invested for the purpose of making a future profit. So, yeah, communists don't want to take your money. They certainly don't want to take your wage. If you're a worker, they don't want to take your worker's wage from you. If anything, they want to abolish that system entirely, so that instead of earning a wage, you earn the total value of the labor that you put into that object. You get out proportionally what you put in. That's what happens in a communist or a socialist system. In a capitalist system, you don't get out nearly the amount of labor that you put in, because your boss pays you a wage and takes the surplus value of your labor.
It's okay to take my money and give it to someone else.
So, it's funny that you say communists want to take my money and give it to someone else, when in reality, the money that you earn is being taken by capitalists and given to the capitalist, invested in the business, or invested in the capitalist use of police or the media, or buying out politicians, or any of the other different facets and aspects of capitalist investment.
I earned it, so what gives you a right to it?
In a pure, stateless, currencyless, communist society.
Right to it.
And just one more thing about this. They have a point here. The worker is entitled to the value produced by their labor, are they not? It's like quoting BioShock. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? And even though BioShock was like an Ayn Randian hellscape libertarian universe that these people would probably love, it rings true. It's basically the labor theory of value. A person's labor generates the value of a given commodity. And so this person feeling outraged that someone is taking their money that they earned through the input of their labor, that's a good anger. That's a working class anger. Direct that anger towards the capitalist, the people that are actually taking a chunk of the profit that you generate. All right? So don't blame communists. They want to give you more money. If anything,
it is okay to take my money and give it to someone else. I earned it, so what gives you a right to it?
In a pure, stateless, currencyless, communist society, do you really think people not wanting to be bored and wanting to do what's best for their fellow man is going to be enough of an incentive to hold up the economy, the infrastructure, the crime management, and any possible wars on terror that might have to occur? And in the latter case, how would you defend your borders?
All right, so this is sort of two questions rolled up into one by the scary hoodie demon man. So the first question is, what will incentivize people under communism? And to that I ask, think about all the things that you do in your daily life that you do simply because you enjoy doing it. I make these YouTube videos because I enjoy doing it. I play video games because I enjoy doing it. That's not very productive, but in terms of other productive things I do, I like to garden. I like to study science. So, I mean, these are sorts of things that I would pursue whether or not I stood to earn any kind of money off of it. I'd pursue politics, I'd pursue science. Of course, you know me, I'd pursue video games all day and all night. So these are things that I do, even though I'm not getting paid to do them. And in a capitalist system, we already sort of talked about how it's not voluntary, how you either work or you starve. And so the real incentive in capitalism is starvation. Do you want to starve and die on the street like a dog? Well, if not, work. Work, you fucking pleb. And so that is exactly the paradigm under the capitalist system. So in a communist system, what it would do is liberate the working class. They wouldn't have to worry about starving and dying like a dog on the street, because food would be guaranteed. Your employment would be guaranteed. Your housing would be guaranteed. There would be no homelessness. You wouldn't want for anything outside of like specialty luxury goods, but in terms of general necessities, you wouldn't want for anything. Your wealth would be increased under a communist system. So, I mean, think about all the things that you do. You wouldn't necessarily be paid to do it, but there are painters out there who paint. They don't make good money, but they do it anyway because it's their passion. There are architects and engineers who do their job simply because they love designing buildings. There are doctors that help people simply because they love to help people. There are scientists who research things not to make money, not to make profit, but because they want to genuinely discover more about the world. So, your second question is, how do you defend your borders under communism? And essentially, you tied this in by saying there are going to be like some jobs that people won't want to do. Well, of course, the state can provide incentives to those people to do jobs. Maybe they'll get extra vacation days or something like that. Who knows? But there are, of course, ways to incentivize people to do certain jobs without holding the prospect of starvation and homelessness over their heads, without forcing them to sell their labor on the free market. So in terms of how do you defend your borders under communism or under socialism, well, you have to look at what we mean by communism. Communism is a stateless, classless society that comes about when a superabundance of goods and commodities are produced by the industry that each can take according to his ability and give according to their need. So, I got that backwards. They can take according to their need and give according to their ability. Yeah, shows how much Marx I know. I'm getting the quote backwards, but nevertheless, that is basically how it works. And this relies on a few things. It relies on building a dictatorship of the proletariat. It also requires a global socialist revolution. Because if you have one socialist country that is surrounded by a dozen or more capitalist countries, well, then they will inevitably be attacked. It's imperialism. It's going to happen. So, in the event of the global communist or global socialist revolution, you will see a slow withering away of the state, because you will no longer have this sort of monopoly capitalism competing with monopolies in other countries, and you will no longer have imperialism. Therefore, you will have an end to the incentive to do war. You'll have an end to the necessity of borders, and you'll have a slow but deliberate withering away of the state. And in a socialist system, you get rid of the class divisions and the class antagonisms that separate the bourgeoisie from the proletariat. You have an exclusively proletariat society. And so you don't have classes, you don't have borders, you don't have nations anymore. And in that event, you have communism. Once you have that superabundance, once you have that collective stockpile that everyone can take from. But until then, you need borders, you need a people's army to defend those borders. And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about what are the incentives to defend the people's revolution under communism, there's plenty of incentive. If you care about your fellow workers, if you care about your country, if you care about the fate of the working class in that country, yeah, you should be prepared to fight and defend. But you want to talk about incentives, the state could provide incentives. It doesn't necessarily have to be the capitalist whip. It could be the socialist carrot, my friend.
On terror that might have to occur, and in the latter case, how would you defend your borders?
Can you name one lasting monopoly that came about without government support?
Alright, so this guy wants us to name one lasting monopoly that came without government support. And this sort of ignores something obvious, that the capitalist structure requires a government. It requires a state. Look at the 2008 crash, for example. The big banks had to go to the federal government and ask Uncle Sam to bail them out. If it wasn't for the state apparatus, the capitalist system would have collapsed right then and there. So, capitalism needs the state. It's sort of like a parasite that feeds off the state as an organism. The state is designed to reinforce the structure of capitalism. So, capitalism is inseparable from the state. But you can have a state that's not capitalist. You can have a proletarian state. And that's the kind of state that we communists are interested in building. So, I don't know. This guy seems to think that capitalism can exist independent from any kind of state or government. And I would challenge him. I would challenge him to produce an example of a successful society where you have had a capitalist system completely separated from any kind of government accountability or control.
Name one lasting monopoly that came about without government support.
Your ideology relies on a straw man of the definition for capitalism in order to even be presented.
Okay, and so he says an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. I mean, this definition ignores wage labor. So it's kind of not a good definition.
With this being the case, how can you live with yourself knowing that your entire belief system is based on a lie?
That's not a good question, dude, because you sort of presumed the answer. You were like, why are you such a piece of shit? You know, that's like not a very good question. If you ask somebody why are they such a piece of shit, you're already sort of assuming that they're a piece of shit, and you're sort of asking them to justify why they are a piece of shit. Well, I haven't accepted the premise that I am a piece of shit, buckaroo. So this guy, his whole premise is that we define capitalism as a straw man, and that's a lie. Our definition of capitalism isn't somehow true. I would ask him to point out what part of our definition about capitalism isn't true. Where's the straw man here? You keep saying that it's a straw man, but where specifically is the fucking straw man?
If force is used to accomplish your means, how can anyone be equal? People will always be under the thumb of whoever enforces your communist laws. I don't know, it just seems a little backwards to advocate for equality, but then to give a small group of people power over others.
Alright, we can go back to the slavery example. Is it hypocritical to ask for the abolition of slavery and to enforce that law by force? If somebody kept owning slaves, is it immoral to take that person and lock them in jail? Is it denying them a freedom to oppress other people? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that you have to ask yourself. Is it hypocritical to use state power to enforce equality? I don't think that's hypocritical at all, because it works both ways. Inequality is enforced by state power. So the workers rising up and using state power to enforce equality instead of inequality, well, that's their right. And you don't call it a misuse of political force when the government is upholding the rights of private property and the rights of free enterprise. But all of a sudden it becomes a bad use of force when you are trying to bring equality and workers' rights to the forefront.
Doesn't really sound like equality, does it?
Why do you want communism when all it does is keep everyone in the same hole? Communism only keeps you breathing, not living.
Alright, so this guy says, communism keeps you living, but not breathing. We can go back to our example of how involuntary capitalism forces you to sell your labor on the market simply so that you can live and sustain yourself. So if anything, it's hilarious, because if anything, the reverse is true. Capitalism keeps you living, but not breathing. It keeps you barely scraping by, barely making enough money to feed yourself, to pay the rent, to pay tuition, to pay medical bills, to pay for all this shit. And at the end of the day, you barely have enough money to spend for luxury goods, like video games, and anime. Alright, so if anything, capitalism keeps you living, but not breathing. It keeps you barely above the water, barely able to survive, just desperate enough so you keep coming back to work every single day, selling your labor to your boss, being exploited. It keeps you just poor enough to where you can't become a capitalist yourself. You are forced to remain a worker. There's no upward mobility. So, it's funny, he asked, communism keeps you living, not breathing, almost like it's a truism, like it's a statement that everybody knows is true, but in reality, that's the truth for capitalism. Capitalism keeps you just barely able to survive. Just long enough for you to keep coming back to work every single day, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's the capitalist system. And that is the end of our questions asked by these anarcho-capitalists. I actually had a few good questions, but most of them were stupid. Most of them were presumptuous. Most of them had a sort of a snarky gotcha sort of built right into the questions, baked right in. So I hope you enjoyed me answering these questions for Ancaps. If you're an Ancap and you watch this, please check out my other videos. I hope that you find this content enlightening. I hope that I answered some of your questions. Probably wasn't the answers that you wanted to hear, but, you know, I'm a communist. I'm not going to, jerk off the free market, and I'm certainly not going to, sit here and pretend like anarcho-capitalism is the solution, because it's obviously not. It's a joke of a philosophy that seeks to put corporate power, unaccountable private entities at the forefront of society. It's essentially a neo-feudal society. So anyway, I've said my piece. Let me know what you think in the comments down below.